My boss called me the network's diversity hire and laughed when I mentioned the love interest might be black. When I tried to explain my reasoning, he patronizingly patted my head and said, "Sweet that you think this was about racism." I bit my tongue. That was just 1 month ago. Yesterday his hand shook, his coffee mug shattered, and he sat in silence for the rest of the meeting. There are moments in life that feel like a punch to the gut, where pure injustice just burns. For me, that moment came when a room full of arrogant men, convinced of their own brilliance, started to dissect my book, the one I wrote, and told me everything I supposedly got wrong, all while sneering at the idea that someone like me could possibly understand it. Back then, finding out my dystopian novel was being adapted for TV was a dream come true. I'd written it under a pen name when I was just 24, and the news that it was going to be a show felt like the biggest break of my life. Then the network head gave me an even bigger surprise. He wanted me to join the writer's room. He said they needed fresh perspectives, that my background would bring valuable insights. What he didn't tell anyone was that I was the actual author. And honestly, I thought, great. I'll just let my work speak for itself. I figured walking in and announcing my identity would feel a bit self-important. Big mistake. My first day was a rude awakening. The showrunner greeted me with this barely concealed sneer. "So you're the network's diversity hire," he practically spat out. The other 5 writers, all older men like easily over 40, just glared at me, like I'd shown up and stolen their coffee, their job, their very existence. I tried to be polite. "I'm looking forward to working with everyone," I said, trying to project confidence as I took my seat. I actually have some thoughts about the Underground Railroad themes in the book that could translate really powerfully on screen. The head writer cut me off immediately. "Thoughts?" he scoffed. "That's adorable. Honey, I've been analyzing literature since before you were born. This book requires maturity to grasp. The network forced you on us, sure, but that doesn't mean you understand the material." Then the showrunner launched into his vision for my book. He pulled up a presentation, slides and everything. "The author," he proclaimed, "is clearly writing from middle-aged disillusionment. The protagonist is obviously the author himself, a brilliant man trapped by society's expectations." I tried to speak up, my voice tight. I interpreted the protagonist as a stand-in for, but he cut me off. That's exactly the surface-level interpretation I'd expect from a diversity hire. This is prestige television. Just because the network forced you on us doesn't mean we use your ideas. My blood was boiling. I knew exactly what I'd intended when writing that character. I wanted to scream to correct them right then and there. But their hostility was so raw, so naked, it stopped me. I swallowed the words. Maybe, just maybe, if I earned their respect first, the revelation would go smoother. Over the next few weeks, that hope died a slow, painful death. Every single idea I pitched got shot down, dismissed with increasing condescension. I remember one meeting so clearly. I suggested the love interest in the book should be black, just like I'd written her. The showrunner actually laughed so hard he spilled his coffee. "Where'd you get that idea?" he sneered, wiping his mouth. "Because she has curly hair?" The author describes her as golden in the lamplight. Obviously she's white. This is why networks shouldn't interfere with creative teams. I tried to argue, but Chapter 12 mentions her dealing with assumptions based on appearance, which clearly alludes to her race. He cut me off again. "You're reading too much into it because you want to see yourself in everything. Stop forcing diversity where it doesn't exist." Can you imagine? My character. I'd woven Underground Railroad imagery carefully throughout the entire novel. When I pitched exploring that, the head writer literally patted my head. "Sweetie, that you think this was about racism," he said like I was a child. "The tunnels are clearly metaphors for the internet. You'd understand if you'd studied real literature instead of whatever quotas got you here." I told him, "There are literal Frederick Douglass quotes embedded in the text." He just waved me off. "Anyone can find coincidences. This author is too sophisticated for your obvious parallels. The network may force us to have you here, but we don't have to pretend your ideas have merit." Every single character discussion was the same. They would correct my interpretations of my own work. When I tried to explain that Sarah's deep-seated anger came from generational trauma, a theme I poured my soul into, the showrunner rolled his eyes so dramatically I thought they might get stuck. Not everything is trauma and identity politics, he scoffed. What is it with you people and bringing race into everything? The author understands human nature a lot better than you do. One day, I overheard them talking about me at the water cooler. They were saying how stupid I was for not understanding that white male characters were universal, and that I was desperate for wanting to see people who looked like me on screen. People like her, my boss said with a dismissive eye roll. They make everything about what color they are. They're the real racists. Week after excruciating week, they incorrectly explained my metaphors. They told me I was everything wrong with forced diversity in writer rooms. They made jokes about babysitting me. You probably think the author is a woman, someone snickered. Or black, another chimed in. Just because they understand oppression doesn't mean they're not a white man. You just want to demonize white people. I spoke carefully, my voice surprisingly steady. I didn't say that. All I said was the author could be anyone, even a young black woman. They erupted into laughter. Laughter. A young black woman, they guffawed. Writing this level of prose? The network really found someone delusional. My boss added. I thought she was just here for racial diversity, but maybe she's our psychotic representation as well. But that moment right then, as I stood at my absolute breaking point, the studio head walked in. He was beaming, radiating this oblivious, cheerful energy. Everyone in the room jumped up, straightening their clothes, scrambling to look impressive. Sorry to barge in, he announced. Just wanted to check how the author of our book is settling in. When she agreed to join personally, I couldn't believe our luck. He looked directly at me. Hope these gentlemen have been receptive to your vision for your own book. How has your first month been? My boss, the showrunner, dropped his coffee mug. Crash. The silence that followed was deafening. 6 men, who'd spent 4 weeks systematically insulting and belittling me, suddenly understood. They realized who I was. And they knew that the very next words out of my mouth could end their careers forever. I took a deep, slow breath, feeling every single eye in the room boring into me. The showrunner's face had gone from smug superiority to absolute ashen shock. The head writer still had his hand frozen in midair, right where he'd been gesturing dismissively moments before. The studio head just kept beaming, utterly oblivious to the raw, crackling tension in the air. I stood slowly, deliberately smoothing down my shirt. Then I gave him the brightest, sweetest smile I could possibly manage. It's been quite an educational experience, I told him, my voice calm. Watching how the team has interpreted my work. The showrunner's coffee mug, the one he'd dropped, finally hit the floor, shattering ceramic across the pristine writer room carpet. Brown liquid spread into an expanding puddle, and no one, not a single one of them, moved to clean it. The studio head's eyebrows rose slightly at the mess, but I kept talking, still calm, about how fascinating it was to see my themes discussed from such unique perspectives. I drew out that word, unique, just enough to watch the head writer visibly flinch. The showrunner finally found his voice, but it came out strangled, like he was choking on his own words. He stammered something about not realizing, about the network keeping secrets, about how they would have treated me differently if only they'd known. His hands were visibly shaking as he bent to pick up the larger pieces of his shattered mug. I watched him struggle with the ceramic shards, his fingers trembling. The other writers were still frozen in their seats, their faces cycling through every shade of panic you can imagine. One of them, the guy who'd called me psychotic representation, was so pale I genuinely thought he might faint. The studio head, bless his heart, looked between us, his smile finally faltering as the atmosphere began to sink in. He asked if everything was all right, if there'd been some misunderstanding. His tone shifted, though, like he was starting to piece together exactly what kind of welcome I'd received. I, ever the professional, just assured him we were just surprised by the sudden visit. Then I turned to my colleagues, my gaze sweeping over their terrified faces. We should probably clean up the coffee before it stains the carpet, I suggested, my voice calm and practical. That mundane suggestion seemed to break their paralysis. Suddenly, everyone was moving, scrambling for paper towels, stammering apologies. The showrunner kept repeating, I had no idea. If someone had just told me. This is all a terrible miscommunication. His words tumbled out, tripping over each other, as he frantically dabbed at the coffee stain, which, naturally, only seemed to spread wider with his efforts. I knelt beside him with my own paper towels, working methodically at the edges of the spill. Our hands nearly touched as we cleaned, and he jerked back as if I'd burned him. The head writer hovered nearby, opening and closing his mouth like a fish out of water, gasping for air. The studio head watched this whole performance with increasing concern. He then mentioned that he'd specifically asked the network head to keep my identity quiet at first, to let me get a feel for the room without any preconceptions. His tone implied he was seriously rethinking the wisdom of that decision. I stood, dropping the soaked paper towels into the trash, and told him, it definitely gave me an authentic perspective on the creative process. The showrunner made a choking sound. I couldn't tell if it was a laugh or a sob. One of the writers, the one who'd so confidently insisted my protagonist was obviously a middle-aged white man, finally found his voice. He babbled something about how they'd been analyzing the text academically, how they hadn't meant anything personal. His voice actually cracked on the word personal. I just nodded thoughtfully, pretending to consider his profound insights. Then I casually mentioned how interesting it was that they'd found so many interpretations I'd never considered when writing it. Like the tunnels being metaphors for the internet instead of the Underground Railroad imagery I'd researched for months. The head writer's face flushed a deep angry red. He started to explain that literary criticism was subjective, that authors didn't always understand their own subconscious meanings. Then he seemed to remember who he was talking to and just trailed off mid-sentence, looking utterly humiliated. The studio head's expression had shifted. The concern was gone, replaced by something much harder, much colder. He looked at me, asked if I'd been sharing my thoughts on the adaptation, if the team had been receptive to my input. The temperature in the room seemed to plummet several degrees. I chose my words carefully. Everyone has been very clear about their vision for the show, I said. The showrunner's hands clenched and unclenched at his sides as I spoke. And I've certainly learned a lot about how different people can read the same text. The studio head's jaw tightened. He turned directly to the showrunner. Have you been utilizing her expertise? Have you been respectful of her contributions? The question hung in the air like a razor-sharp blade. The showrunner's mouth worked soundlessly for a moment before he managed to stammer out something about creative differences, miscommunication about roles and expectations. Sweat beaded on his forehead, even with the air conditioning blasting. I just watched him squirm. Every dismissive comment, every patronizing explanation of my own work flashed through my mind. Part of me wanted to unleash everything, list every insult, every time they'd made me feel small and stupid. But I held my tongue, letting the silence stretch, thick and suffocating. The studio head's phone buzzed, a sudden jarring sound. He glanced at it, then announced he had to take the call, but promised to be back. He looked directly at me. We'll be having a longer conversation very soon about the show's direction, he said, his tone grim. Then he left, closing the door with a decisive click. The moment that door shut, the room erupted. It was a cacophony of voices, overlapping, a chaos of frantic excuses and desperate explanations. The showrunner took a step toward me. His hands spread in what he probably imagined was a placating gesture. We need to discuss this like professionals, he whined, his voice taking on this absolutely sickening, wheedling quality. Surely you understand we hadn't meant any harm? The same voice that had called me a diversity hire now dripped with the falsest sincerity I'd ever heard. I just stood there silent, watching them scramble, enjoying every second of their panic. The head writer tried a different tactic. Actually, he mused, as if a profound thought had just struck him. Now that I think about it, I can see how the Underground Railroad imagery works. His about-face was so abrupt, so blatant. It would have been hilarious if I hadn't been so utterly livid. Another writer chimed in. We'd always thought the love interest might be black. I'd been meaning to bring it up. This from the very man who'd laughed at the suggestion just days ago. Their desperate revisionism was frankly pathetic. Just then the showrunner's assistant knocked and entered, a godsend. She reminded him about a scheduled call with the network. His face, already ghostly white, went even paler. He tried to push it back, but she insisted the network head was already on the line. He looked at me with pure panic in his eyes, then muttered an excuse and fled the room. As he reached the door he turned back, a pathetic plea in his voice. "Can we talk privately after my call?" he asked. I just gave him a cool nod. "I'll be here," I said, working on my notes for the show. After he left, the remaining writers seemed to deflate, like balloons losing air. One by one, they found flimsy excuses to leave, mumbling about urgent meetings or impossible deadlines. The head writer lingered the longest, clearing his throat several times, as if preparing some grand speech, but in the end he said nothing. He just shuffled out. Finally, I was alone in that writer's room, surrounded by whiteboards covered with their grotesque misinterpretations of my work. I walked slowly, deliberately around the room, reading their notes with new eyes. Every wrong assumption, every missed theme, every whitewashed character glared back at me from those whiteboards. I pulled out my phone and started taking pictures of the boards. Evidence. I wasn't sure what I'd do with it yet, but my hands were steady. The shock had given way to a cold, hard determination. They had shown me exactly who they were. Now it was my turn. Footsteps in the hallway. I quickly pocketed my phone. The showrunner reappeared, his face grim, and closed the door behind him, leaning against it as if to bar us in. "We need to figure out how to move forward," he said, his tone oozing condescension. "The show's too important to let personal feelings interfere. Even now, some habits died hard." I sank back into my chair, the very one I'd sat in through weeks of humiliation, and waited. My silence unnerved him. He fidgeted with his phone, avoiding eye contact. Finally, he offered what he probably thought was an olive branch. He suggested we start fresh, pretend the last month hadn't happened. He'd make sure the team respected my input going forward. His tone implied he was doing me a huge favor. "Clarify for me," I said, my voice dangerously calm. "What exactly are we pretending hadn't happened?" The question caught him off guard. He stammered something about misunderstandings and getting off on the wrong foot. Pressed him. "Do you mean the time you called me a diversity hire? Or when you said I was too young to understand literature? Or perhaps when you laughed at my suggestion about the love interest's race?" His face grew redder with each example. He tried to interrupt, but I kept going. I brought up the head writer patting my head, the jokes about babysitting me, the water cooler conversation about people like me being the real racists. My voice remained calm, almost conversational. When I finished, the silence stretched between us like a chasm. He looked older suddenly, the confident swagger replaced by something desperate. He tried to speak several times, each attempt dying before it could form words. I watched him struggle, his mouth opening and closing like a landed fish. Finally, he managed to speak, his voice strained and artificial. "We should focus on the future," he insisted, rather than dwelling on past misunderstandings. That word, misunderstandings, made my jaw clench, but I kept my expression neutral. He turned to the whiteboard and with broad, aggressive strokes, he started erasing my carefully photographed notes. He explained they'd been planning to take the show in a bold new direction anyway, one that would really showcase the material's potential. His back was to me, but I could see the tension in his shoulders. "What kind of direction?" I asked. He turned, marker in hand, and began sketching out a completely different story arc. The protagonist was now a middle-aged white professor. The love interest? His graduate student. And the Underground Railroad imagery? That would become a metaphor for academic freedom. My stomach churned. I watched him systematically destroy everything I'd created, everything I'd poured my soul into. He finished with a flourish, clearly expecting me to protest, to beg. Instead, I calmly pulled out my notebook and began taking detailed notes. This seemed to unnerve him more than any anger would have. "What are you writing?" he asked, a hint of suspicion in his voice. "I'm documenting your creative vision for the show," I told him. The head writer returned then, trailed by the others. They'd clearly been conspiring in the hallway because they moved with a coordinated, almost military purpose. The showrunner, emboldened, briefed them on his new direction. They all nodded enthusiastically, praising his brilliant reinterpretation of my source material. One writer suggested they could minimize my involvement by assigning me to write character backstories that would never make it into the actual scripts. Another proposed I could research historical details for authenticity, effectively keeping me busy but utterly irrelevant. They discussed this openly as if I wasn't even sitting right there taking notes. My pen moved steadily across the page. The head writer, ever the busybody, noticed and asked to see what I was writing. I showed him. It was a verbatim record of their conversation. His face went bone white when he saw his own words about keeping me busy but irrelevant written clearly in my neat handwriting. The showrunner, seeing the shift, abruptly called for a break, suggesting everyone take 15 minutes to regroup. As the others filed out, he asked me to stay behind. Once we were alone, he dropped all pretense of professionalism. "You have two choices," he snarled. "Play along with our vision, or find yourself mysteriously unable to contribute due to creative differences." I kept my voice flat. "Elaborate on playing along." He laid it out. I would publicly support their interpretation, attend meetings, but only speak when asked, essentially becoming a silent figurehead. In exchange, I'd keep my credit and paycheck. The alternative, he implied, would be much less pleasant. Before I could even respond, the studio head returned, and this time he wasn't alone. The network head was with him. They'd been discussing the show's progress and wanted an update. The showrunner, ever the narcissist, immediately launched into an enthusiastic pitch about their new direction, even claiming I'd been instrumental in developing these fresh ideas. I watched the studio head's face. His expression grew increasingly skeptical, especially when the showrunner dared to claim I'd suggested making the protagonist a middle-aged professor. When he finished, the studio head turned to me. "Your thoughts on these changes?" he asked. The room held its breath. I could feel the showrunner's eyes boring into me, willing me to play along, to lie, to save them. Instead, I opened my notebook. I began reading from my notes, starting with the showrunner's suggestion that we pretend the last month hadn't happened. I read his exact words about keeping me busy but irrelevant, about creative differences, about me becoming a silent figurehead. The network head's face darkened with each damning word. When I finished, he just held out his hand. "May I see that?" I handed over my notebook. He flipped through pages of carefully documented conversations, dismissed ideas, condescending comments. His jaw tightened as he read. The showrunner tried to interject, stammering about misunderstanding or taking things out of context. The studio head silenced him with a single icy look. Then he turned to me. "What do you think should happen with the show?" I took a deep breath. And then I outlined my original vision, the one I poured my heart into years ago when I wrote the novel. The other writers returned during my explanation, freezing in the doorway as they realized what was happening. I continued speaking, describing the themes they'd dismissed, the characters they'd whitewashed, the metaphors they'd so willfully misunderstood. The head writer tried to interrupt, but the network head shut him down. "Let her finish," he commanded. When I concluded, the studio head turned to the showrunner. "Explain," he demanded, "why you systematically ignored the author's vision for her own work." The showrunner's response was a masterclass in deflection, blaming creative differences, claiming artistic interpretation, even suggesting that authors didn't always understand their own work's potential. The network head wasn't buying it. Not for a second. He turned to each writer one by one and asked them directly, what did they think of my interpretations versus the showrunners? One by one, they predictably sided with their boss, though their enthusiasm was so forced it was painful to watch. Only the youngest writer hesitated, his eyes darting between me and the showrunner, before he mumbled his support for the new direction. The studio head thanked everyone for their input, then announced he needed to make some calls. He looked at me directly. "Join me in my office in an hour," he said. As he left with the network head, I could hear them talking in low, serious tones. The showrunner's face had gone from angry red to sickly white. The moment the executives were gone, the atmosphere in the room turned venomous. The showrunner rounded on me, accusing me of sabotaging the production, of being unable to separate my ego from the creative process. The head writer piled on, adding that I'd proven exactly why diversity hires were dangerous, because we bring politics into everything. I just gathered my things calmly, ignoring their escalating accusations, their desperate rage. As I reached the door, the showrunner screamed, "You're making a huge mistake. You'll never work in television again if you continue down this path." I paused just for a moment, considering a scorching retort. Then I simply left without a single word. In the hallway, I ran into the youngest writer. He approached me hesitantly, looking around to make sure we were completely alone. He admitted he'd actually read my book multiple times. He understood exactly what I'd been trying to say in our meetings. He'd just been too afraid to speak up, worried about his career. "Why are you telling me this now?" I asked. He pulled out his phone and showed me a recording. He'd been documenting the meetings too, initially for his own reference, but he'd captured several particularly damaging conversations. He offered to share them with me. "Someone needs to stand up to them," he said. Back in my temporary office, I listened to his recordings. They were worse than I'd remembered. The showrunner openly discussing how to minimize my involvement. The head writer suggesting they could claim any good ideas as their own. Another writer joking about making me fetch coffee. My hands shook with raw anger as I listened. The hour passed quickly. I made my way to the studio head's office, where I found him in deep discussion with the network head and a woman I didn't recognize. She introduced herself as the head of human resources. My stomach dropped. I instantly understood the gravity of her presence. They asked me to describe my experience in detail. I spoke for nearly an hour, supplementing my account with the youngest writer's damning recordings. The HR head took copious notes, occasionally asking clarifying questions. The studio head's expression grew stonier with each revelation. When I finished, they asked me what outcome I wanted. I told them I just wanted my story told correctly, with the themes and characters I'd originally created. The network head looked at me. "Do you think that's possible with the current team?" I hesitated, then admitted, "I have doubts." The studio head made a decision. He announced they would be restructuring the writer's room, bringing in new voices who understood the material. He then looked at me. "Would you be willing to stay on in a consulting producer role, with real authority over the creative direction?" I agreed, though a part of me wondered how the showrunner would react to that. The meeting ended with handshakes and assurances. As I left, the HR head asked me to document everything in writing and mentioned there would be sensitivity training for the entire production. I nodded, but honestly, I doubted training would change minds that were already so firmly, stubbornly set. I returned to the writer's room to find it in absolute chaos. Word had somehow already spread about the meeting. The showrunner was on the phone, his voice raised, talking about contracts and creative control. The other writers huddled together, shooting me dark, resentful looks as I entered. The showrunner ended his call and immediately confronted me. He accused me of destroying months of work, of being vindictive and unprofessional. I calmly reminded him that I'd simply told the truth about my own book. This seemed to enrage him further, and he stepped closer, his face contorted with fury. The head writer, ever the instigator, pulled the showrunner back. He suggested they all take the rest of the day to process this development. As they gathered their things, I heard him mutter something about entitled millennials destroying the industry. I bit my tongue hard, knowing any response would only escalate their pathetic rage. Alone again, I surveyed the empty room. The whiteboard still showed faint traces of their misinterpretations, ghost images of erased notes. I picked up a marker and began writing, sketching out my original vision for the pilot episode. It felt like reclaiming something that had been stolen from me. The youngest writer, Nathan, returned as I worked. He apologized again for not speaking up in the meeting, explaining his fear of being blacklisted. I told him I understood completely. I'd been silent for weeks myself. He offered to help with the new outline, and together we began reconstructing my original narrative. As we worked, he shared stories about the writer's room dynamics before I'd arrived. The casual racism, the dismissive attitudes toward younger writers, the deep-seated assumption that only middle-aged white men could create serious art. My experience, he confessed, was only slightly worse than usual. Later, the studio head appeared in the doorway, surveying our work. He nodded approvingly at the outline themes and character descriptions. He informed us that the showrunner had been asked to take a few days to consider his position. The implication was crystal clear: cooperate with the new direction or leave the project. Over the next few days, the production entered a strange limbo. The showrunner was technically still in charge, but everyone knew his authority was completely compromised. He attended meetings stone-faced and silent, contributing only when directly asked. The other writers followed his lead, creating an atmosphere of passive, resentful resistance. I meanwhile focused on developing the pilot script, working closely with the studio head to ensure my original vision remained perfectly intact. We brought in incredible consultants to address the historical elements, experts who actually understood the Underground Railroad references I'd embedded throughout. Their genuine enthusiasm for the material reminded me why I'd written it in the first place, why it mattered so much. The head writer, in one last pathetic power play, circulated a memo questioning my qualifications and suggesting the production was being derailed by political correctness. The memo backfired spectacularly when someone leaked it to the network executives. His position became utterly untenable, and he quietly resigned rather than face further scrutiny. One by one, like rats fleeing a sinking ship, the original writers began leaving the project. Some claimed creative differences, others found sudden opportunities elsewhere. Only Nathan, the youngest writer, remained truly grateful for the chance to work on something meaningful. The showrunner held out the longest, clinging to power, but eventually, even he announced his departure. The studio then brought in Alina Joe as the new showrunner. She was a rising star, known for her nuanced handling of complex themes. Our very first meeting felt like a revelation. She had read my book multiple times, understood every single layer of meaning, and had ideas that enhanced, rather than erased, my vision. We spent hours discussing the characters, the themes, the visual language that would bring the story to life. She brought in a diverse team of writers who approached the material with respect and genuine understanding. The writer's room transformed. It went from a hostile, suffocating environment to a vibrant, creative haven. Nathan flourished in this new atmosphere. His insights were valued, his contributions acknowledged. He told me privately that he'd learned more in a week with the new team than he had in months with the old guard. I watched him grow more confident with each passing day. As we developed the scripts, I started discovering sabotage attempts from the departed team. They'd filed complaints with the guild, spread vicious rumors about production troubles, even tried to poach key crew members. Alina handled each challenge with incredible grace, never letting their petty vindictiveness derail our progress. The pilot script took shape beautifully. Sarah, my protagonist, emerged exactly as I'd always envisioned her. Complex, flawed, brilliant, and undeniably black. The Underground Railroad imagery wove through every single scene, subtle but unmistakable. The love story carried the heavy weight of history, while feeling immediate and powerfully real. During a table read, I watched actors bring my words to life for the very first time. The young woman playing Sarah understood her completely, finding nuances in the character that even I hadn't fully realized. When she delivered a key monologue about inherited trauma, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. The network executives attended the read, and their response exceeded my wildest hopes. They greenlit the full season on the spot, with a budget that would truly do justice to the story. As we celebrated, a wave of emotion washed over me. I thought about those first horrible weeks, and how agonizingly close I'd come to letting them win. Alina pulled me aside during the celebration. She'd heard through industry contacts that the former showrunner was struggling to find work. His reputation for being difficult, for being a bully, had finally caught up with him. She asked if I felt vindicated. I considered the question. More than satisfaction, I realized I felt immense relief. Production began in earnest. The set design perfectly captured the dual reality of the story, with hidden passages and underground spaces that mirrored the characters' interior lives. Watching the physical world of my imagination take shape was surreal, and deeply, deeply moving. The former writers, however, weren't done. They made one final desperate attempt to undermine the production. They gave interviews to trade publications, claiming they'd been forced out for refusing to compromise their artistic integrity. The articles painted me as a difficult author who couldn't let go of control. Alina wisely advised me to ignore them, but the lies stung. Then Nathan surprised me. He wrote a powerful, blistering rebuttal, detailing his experience in both writers' rooms. Other crew members, empowered by his courage, came forward with their own stories. Soon the narrative shifted. The truth about the toxic environment, about the casual bigotry and incompetence, emerged. It vindicated my actions completely. And the former showrunner's career? It never recovered. As we wrapped the first season, I reflected on the incredible journey. The show had become everything I dreamed of and so much more. Sarah's story resonated deeply with audiences who had been hungry for complex representation. The Underground Railroad theme sparked important conversations about history and its painful echoes in the present. Alina and I had developed an incredibly strong working relationship, built on mutual respect and shared vision. She pushed me to dig deeper into my characters, to explore corners of the story I'd been afraid to examine. Under her brilliant guidance, I grew not just as a writer, but as a true creative collaborator. Nathan, the youngest writer, had become a trusted friend and colleague. He had found his voice in our writer's room, contributing scripts that honored the source material while bringing vital new perspectives. Watching him succeed, watching his talent shine, felt like a quiet, yet profound victory against the very system that had tried to silence both of us. On the last day of filming, the entire cast and crew gathered for a wrap party. The young actress playing Sarah gave this incredibly moving speech about what the role meant to her, how rare it was to play a character with such depth and agency. Her words were a powerful reminder of why I'd fought so hard to preserve my vision. As I looked around at the celebration, I noticed how profoundly different this environment was from those first terrible weeks. The room buzzed with pure creative energy, genuine mutual respect, and an almost palpable excitement about the work we'd done. We hadn't just built a successful show, we'd built a community. The studio head found me during the party. He apologized again for the rocky start, and genuinely thanked me for persevering. He told me that the network had actually implemented new policies about author involvement and diverse hiring practices. My experience, he said, had led to systematic changes that would benefit future productions. I thought about the showrunner's sneering threat that I'd never work in television again. Instead, I'd helped create a new groundbreaking model for how authors could be truly involved in adaptations. The undeniable success of our approach had other networks scrambling to reconsider their practices. Sometimes standing your ground, holding on to your truth, creates ripples far beyond your own story. The very next morning, I arrived at the studio to find security guards stationed outside the writer's room. And there he was, the showrunner, face purple with rage, arguing wildly at the locked door, gesturing like a madman. The head of security calmly explained that the studio had revoked his access, pending an investigation into workplace conduct. I walked past him without even a glance, swiping my badge to enter. Inside, Alina Jo was already there, reviewing scripts with Nathan and two new writers she brought in. They looked up as I entered, and Alina gestured to an empty chair beside her. The contrast to my first day was stark. The showrunner pounded on the glass door, shouting something I couldn't hear through the soundproofing. Alina glanced at him briefly, then calmly returned her attention to the script. She pointed out a scene that needed strengthening, asking Nathan for his thoughts. His suggestions were sharp, insightful, and valued. Over the following weeks, the production transformed completely. Alina restructured everything, from casting to crew assignments. The former showrunner, desperate, attempted various disruptions, showing up at production meetings uninvited, sending hostile emails to department heads, even trying to convince actors that the show would fail without him. Each pathetic attempt backfired spectacularly. The costume designer, who'd endured his micromanagement for years, publicly supported Alina's vision. The cinematographer shared stories of the showrunner's past behavior that made my own experience seem mild in comparison. Department by department, the entire production rallied behind the new direction. I soon discovered the true extent of their sabotage when our production coordinator found altered script pages in the system. Someone had accessed the files remotely, changing key character descriptions and dialogue. The changes were subtle, but would have fundamentally warped the story's meaning. Digital forensics traced the access straight to the former headwriter's login. Alina handled it brilliantly. She implemented new security protocols, changed all access codes, and documented everything for the studio's legal team. The network executives were furious about the breach. They expanded their investigation to include potential criminal charges for the unauthorized access. The casting process revealed even more interference. Several actors mentioned receiving calls warning them away from the project, claiming it was troubled and would damage their careers. One young actress even showed me texts from the former showrunner, promising her better roles, if she withdrew from consideration for Sarah. We cast the show anyway, finding brilliant, dedicated actors who understood the material deeply. The actress who won the role of Sarah had actually written her thesis on contemporary adaptations of historical trauma. Her audition left everyone in the room stunned. She embodied everything I'd imagined when creating the character. During pre-production, I worked closely with all the department heads to ensure every visual element supported the story's themes. The production designer created underground spaces that felt both literal and powerfully metaphorical. The costume designer developed a color palette that evolved with Sarah's journey, subtly telling her story through clothes. Every single detail mattered. The former writers attempted one last coordinated attack, filing a complaint with the Writers Guild, claiming they'd been discriminated against for their artistic vision. The complaint was so poorly constructed and contradictory, it actually strengthened our position. The Guild's investigation instead uncovered a damning pattern of their past behavior on other productions. Nathan thrived in his new role as story editor. He caught continuity issues others missed, suggested dialogue improvements that enhanced character voices, and mentored the newer writers with incredible patience and skill. Watching him grow into his confidence was one of the most satisfying aspects of the entire experience. Alina and I developed a shorthand that made collaboration effortless. She understood my vision implicitly while bringing her own profound insights that elevated the material. When she suggested exploring Sarah's relationship with her grandmother more deeply, it opened up emotional layers I hadn't fully explored in the novel, making the story even richer. The first day of filming was unexpectedly emotional. Standing on set watching Sarah's world come to life, exactly as I'd imagined it, overwhelmed me. The actress playing Sarah approached me between takes, her eyes shining. She thanked me for creating a character that reflected her own family's history. Her heartfelt gratitude resonated deep within me, a powerful reminder of why representation truly mattered. The former showrunner made headlines when he was arrested for trespassing, after repeatedly attempting to access the production offices. His mugshot circulated through industry newsletters, a final public humiliation that effectively ended any remaining credibility he had. And the head writer's unauthorized access to our scripts? That resulted in criminal charges for computer fraud. As filming progressed, the dailies exceeded everyone's expectations. The performances were nuanced, raw, and powerful. The cinematography captured both beauty and pain. The Underground Railroad imagery worked even better on screen than on the page. Network executives visited the set, their enthusiasm genuine and infectious. Alina had implemented a writer's room culture built on mutual respect and creative risk-taking. Young writers felt safe pitching bold ideas. Experienced writers mentored without condescending. The room became a space where the best idea won, regardless of who suggested it. It was everything the previous room hadn't been. The production faced normal challenges, of course, weather delays, budget constraints, but the team's incredible collaborative spirit made solutions easy to find. When we needed to cut an expensive location, the writers reimagined the scene in a way that actually strengthened the emotional impact. Creativity flourished under supportive leadership. Nathan, my young friend, wrote what became the season's most powerful episode, exploring generational trauma through 3 timelines. His script wove past and present seamlessly, using the Underground Railroad imagery to connect historical and contemporary injustices. The network called it the best script they'd read all year. Post-production brought new satisfactions. The composer created a score that incorporated field recordings from actual Underground Railroad sites. The editor found rhythms that honored both the thriller elements and the deeper themes. Every single department understood they were creating something truly meaningful. Meanwhile, the former writers' careers continued to implode. 2 were dropped by their agencies after other clients came forward with similar stories of their toxicity. The showrunner's production company folded when investors withdrew support. Their pathetic attempts to paint themselves as victims of cancel culture only accelerated their professional decline. Test screenings generated extraordinary responses. Audiences connected deeply with Sarah's journey, understanding the layered metaphors while absolutely devouring the suspenseful plot. The network ordered a 2nd season before we'd even finished post-production on the first. They also approved my proposal for a writer's training program, a pipeline for new, diverse talent. Alina, ever the visionary, suggested I direct an episode in season 2. The idea terrified and thrilled me equally. She arranged for me to shadow directors during the remainder of season 1, learning the technical aspects while developing my visual storytelling skills. It was another door opening, simply because someone believed in my capabilities. The wrap party felt like a celebration of more than just completing a production. We'd created something that mattered, something profound, while also transforming how the industry might approach adaptations. The studio had publicly announced that our production model would become the new template for future literary adaptations. Industry publications covered our innovative approach to author involvement, and other networks began reaching out, eager to understand how we'd structured the collaboration. What started as one woman defending her work had evolved into a potential industry-wide shift. The ripple effects continued spreading. The premiere approached with electric anticipation. Critics who'd seen advanced screeners universally praised the show's complexity and authenticity. One review in particular moved me to tears, noting how the series honored its source material while finding new, breathtaking depth through the visual medium. They understood what we tried to achieve. On premiere night, I sat in the theater, surrounded by the incredible cast and crew who'd brought my vision to life. Alina squeezed my hand as the opening credits rolled. Nathan sat behind us, his excitement palpable. The young actress playing Sarah radiated pure joy and pride. As the first episode unfolded on screen, I thought back to that horrible first day in the writer's room. The showrunner who'd called me a diversity hire was now unemployable, his career utterly destroyed. The head writer who'd condescendingly patted my head faced criminal charges. The men who tried to erase my vision had instead erased themselves. The show succeeded beyond anyone's wildest expectations. Critics raved about its nuanced exploration of historical trauma and contemporary injustice. Audiences connected deeply with Sarah's journey and the powerful Underground Railroad metaphors. The ratings soared past the network's projections, ensuring multiple seasons to tell the complete story. Alina and I began developing other projects together, building a production company focused specifically on amplifying marginalized voices. Nathan joined us as a development executive, his story instincts proving invaluable. We were actively creating opportunities for writers who might otherwise face the same hostility I'd experienced. The training program I'd proposed launched with 15 participants, all from backgrounds traditionally excluded from writers' rooms. Watching them learn and grow, seeing their confidence build, felt like completing a circle. They wouldn't have to fight the battles I'd faced. The room had fundamentally changed. 6 months after the premiere, I received an unexpected letter. It was from a young black woman who'd watched the show with her grandmother, a civil rights activist. They'd seen their own family story reflected in Sarah's journey. That letter reminded me, more powerfully than anything, why I'd written the book, and why fighting for my vision had mattered so profoundly. The former showrunner's name became industry shorthand for toxic behavior. Production companies added, "Don't pull his name," to their orientation materials. His legacy became a cautionary tale about the devastating consequences of discrimination and professional misconduct. He never worked in television again. I continued writing novels while working in television, finding the mediums complemented each other beautifully. My second book explored similar themes through a different lens, and this time, I maintained creative control from the very start. The industry had learned, and so had I. The show's success opened doors for countless other authors, particularly women and writers of color, to participate meaningfully in adaptations. Networks finally realized that respecting source material and its creators led to genuinely better content. What had felt like a deeply personal battle became part of a larger transformation. Years later, teaching a masterclass on adaptation, I told the story of those first brutal weeks in the writer's room. Young writers listened with wide eyes, with disbelief that such abhorrent behavior had been tolerated so recently. I assured them it was true, but I emphasized how much had changed simply because people stood up. Alina, Nathan, and I built something lasting. Our production company became known for fostering truly inclusive environments where creativity flourished. We proved, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that diversity wasn't a burden, but an undeniable strength. The shows we created reflected the world's complexity and beauty. The series finale aired to universal critical acclaim. Sarah's story concluded in a way that honored her journey, while acknowledging that the struggle continues. The Underground Railroad imagery culminated in a powerful statement about how history echoes through generations. We told the story I'd always envisioned. At the final wrap party, I looked around at the diverse crew we'd assembled. Writers, directors, actors, and craftspeople from every background, all committed to telling stories that mattered. We hadn't just built a successful show. We'd built a new model for how the industry could work. The young actress who played Sarah had become a close friend. She'd gone on to produce her own projects, amplifying other voices, just as Alina had amplified mine. The ripples continued spreading, each success making space for others. The room kept expanding. What an awesome ride this has been. I've really loved diving into all these fascinating moments with you. Seriously, thanks for being part of it. If you made it to the end, drop a comment. I love reading all your comments.